title of our sermon this evening is The Prudence of Abraham. I suppose if you were to think about a character trait of Abram or Abraham, you would most likely go to faith. And the Bible does that. Paul holds him out in Romans chapter 4 as an example of faith. The Hebrew writer holds him out as an example of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. But there's an instance in the life of Abram that struck me one time when I was reading through, doing a daily Bible reading. And that's the place that I want to take us to this evening. And that's found in Genesis chapter 14 and verses 17 through 24. While you're turning there, I'd like to kind of set the context and the background of this particular story, just so that we're a little bit aware of what's going on, so that we'll understand what's happening here in this particular section of Scripture. You'll remember back in Genesis chapter 13 that the herdsmen of Lot and the herdsmen of Abram were quarreling with one another. And you remember that Abram said, "We are brethren. We ought not to behave this way." And so he tells Lot, "You pick where you will go, and I will go the opposite way." And you remember that Lot looks out upon the well-watered plains of the Jordan and sees how green that it is, and he says, "I will go there." And so it says that he pitches his tent toward Sodom. We do find out that eventually he goes even further than toward Sodom, and we find eventually that he is in Sodom. Well, there were, I guess you would call it an alliance between the kings of the plains, Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, these cities that were the cities of the plains, and they had, if you will, an alliance. And in this alliance, they had agreed to pay tribute to Chedorlaomer, who was a king to the north, and he had an alliance too of 3 other kings with him. And the 5 kings of the plains, Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, they decided that we're tired of paying tribute to this king. And so they decided we're going to stop paying tribute. And so they did. Well, as is the case, when the king that's receiving the tribute stops getting the tribute, he goes to teach them a lesson. And it was quite a lesson. Chedorlaomer gets his 4 kings that are with him, and they go down, these 4 kings, they go down and they battle with the 5 kings. And they defeat these 5 kings in Genesis chapter 14, verses 8 through 10. And as punishment for that, we see in Genesis 14, verses 11 and 12, we see that all of the goods, all of the food, all of the people are taken. And we're going to teach these kings a lesson. The kings evidently were left behind, as we see when Abram returns. But the people and the goods and the riches and everything that these kings had, it was taken from them. And so they're on their way back to the north when word gets to Abram that there has been a great battle and that the kings of the plains have been defeated and Lot's been taken. And so Abram gathers his forces and he goes to battle. And he finds this retreating force. He finds them, he attacks them, and he defeats them. And so we pick up our reading in verse 17. Then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer, the kings who were with him, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And he gave him 1/10 of all. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give the people to me, and take the goods for yourself." Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear you would say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their share. Now I have the text for you on the slide that we have just read. And the portion of the text that I want to call your attention to is this portion where the king of Sodom says, I want you to give me the people and you take all the goods. And Abram says, no, I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to do that for fear that you would say, I have made Abram rich. What was Abram's fear? What concerned Abram in this particular situation? What concerned him is that the king of Sodom would claim that he had made Abram rich with what once belonged to him. And that Abram recognized that, at some point in time, while I've got the goods, and the king over here has no goods, he's got the people, but he has no goods, he's struggling maybe even to survive, that there might be a time in the future where the king of Sodom would look over at Abram and say, why don't you look at that guy over there? Why don't you look at how well off he is? Why don't you look how well he's doing? You know why he's that way? He's got all of our money. He's got all of our goods. He's got everything that belongs to us. We made Abram rich. Abram was fearful that was what would be said. Think about this for just a moment. If the king told him to take it, he did not have the right to take it back, right? If the king told him to take it, then he couldn't begrudge the benefit to Abram, right? So why was Abram fearful? Abram knew something. Abram knew that just because the king had no right to take back or to begrudge what was given, didn't mean it couldn't happen. I remember in teaching my children to drive, stories in and of itself on that one, but I can remember teaching them to drive, and I can remember telling them when the light would turn green because they were just so anxious to go, I said, you better look both ways. And they'd say, but Dad, the light's green. Yeah, I know you know that, but I'm concerned with the people that's crossing in front of you. Do they know that? It may be that you've got a green light, but do the other people know they've got a red light? And so I was trying to teach them that, yes, you have the right of way, and they should stop, but just because you have it and they don't, doesn't mean they won't try it. And that's what Abram understood. Abram understood that even though that this might be given to him by the permission, by the acceptance of the king of Sodom, even though he offered that, it didn't mean at some point in time he would decide, I want that back. Or that he would begrudge that. And so it's at this point that I see the prudence of Abram. He had the right. Abram knew that what he had the right to do didn't mean he should do it. And Abram knew that what the king of Sodom had no right to claim didn't mean he wouldn't try to claim it. Abram's understanding of this proved his prudence. And that in this situation, he wasn't naive about what might happen in the future. So how do we define prudence? With the theological workbook of the Old Testament, they take this word, Aram. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so that's how, for our purposes, we're going to pronounce it. They take this Hebrew word, and they say that this word is a root with a positive prudence and a negative shrewdness connotation. Zodhiates said about the same thing. He said it's a feminine singular noun meaning craftiness and prudence. Now that's an interesting thing, isn't it? That a word can have a positive connotation to it and also have a negative connotation to it. The exact same word. When you think about how our English dictionaries define prudence, Merriam-Webster says that prudence is careful good judgment that allows someone to avoid danger or risks. Take the word crafty from vocabulary.com dictionary. The adjective crafty comes from the Old English word kraftig, which meant strong or powerful. But the meaning of crafty these days has to do with being skilled at getting what you want through manipulation, deceit, and trickery. Now, let me try and narrow this down and try to kind of explain the connotations of these two words. When we think about this idea of crafty, remember it's this concept of a man that through manipulation and trickery and deceit, he gets his way. A crafty man will determine, given the situation, how best to take advantage of it for his own benefit. A crafty man will look and say, now how can I use this and get what I want out of it? How can I take advantage of this situation and achieve my ultimate goal? You know, the Bible talks about that the devil is crafty. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1, it stated, the serpent was more crafty than the beast of the field, which the Lord God had made, and he said to the woman, and then we go on and get the rest of that story. But we learn in Genesis 3 and verse 1 that the devil is crafty. He knows how to use situations, and he looks for those situations that he can use and take advantage of. Look at some passages of Scripture wherein we are warned about that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, 5 is the key. But real quick, we'll read the context. Now, concerning the things about which he wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Why are we talking about this? We're talking about this because of what they were doing. And this is why Paul says in verse 5, stop depriving one another of that which belongs to each other. Stop doing that. The husband's body belongs to the wife's body belongs to the husband. There are sexual desires that are to be fulfilled in the bounds of marriage. And these people were depriving their mate of that. And Paul says, stop doing that. But then notice what he says. Stop depriving except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again. Why? So that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Satan, being crafty as he is going to come into this situation where a husband is withholding from the wife, a wife is withholding from the husband, and he's going to come in and say, boy, I can take advantage of this, because he's crafty. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27, beginning in verse 25, therefore laying aside falsehood, speak truth each one of you with his neighbor, but for we are members of one another. Be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Why must anger not be allowed to just continue? Why must anger be something that is dealt with immediately and that I don't hold on to that? Paul tells us, and do not give the devil an opportunity. Malice, ill will, guile, it comes from a heart that is storing anger. And the devil knows, aha, this person's mad, this person's angry, and they're not letting that go. I can use that. I can manipulate that situation and take advantage of them. That's why he's said to be crafty. Let me give you one more example. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, they have withdrawn from the man in 1 Corinthians 5 that Paul wrote. They've withdrawn from this man, and so they've done what Paul asked. And so in verse 6, he says, sufficient for the one is this punishment which is inflicted by the majority. So that on the contrary, you should rather forgive and comfort him. Okay, you didn't want to withdraw from him. I've told you should withdraw from him. You've withdrawn from him. It's had its effect. And he's returned. And so now the punishment has worked. So now you have to forgive and comfort him. Otherwise, such a one might be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. Wherefore I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. For to this end I also wrote, so that I might put you to the test, whether you're obedient in all things. But one whom you forgive anything, I forgive also. For indeed, what have I forgiven? If I have forgiven anything, I did it for your sakes in the presence of Christ. Now, why do we need to do this, Paul says? Look, this is a situation. You have a man that was guilty of sin. And you did what should have been done. You withdrew from him. And it had its effect. And he's repented. And now he's come back. But it seems as though they're not really bringing him back. It seems as though they're not treating him as they should. They're not really treating him as if he's been forgiven, as if there's been any change. And so he says, you need to reaffirm your love for him. You need to understand that he needs that he's been convicted of his sin, and that your love needs to be reaffirmed for him. You need to forgive him of that. Bring him back. Don't overwhelm him, because if you continue where you are, look who's going to step in. So that no advantage will be taken of us by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his schemes. The devil is crafty. He's always looking for situations that he can use to manipulate people to get them to do his will, which is to destroy their souls. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. That's the negative connotation of that word. But the positive connotation of that is that the prudent man will determine, given the situation, how best not to be taken advantage of by others. The crafty man is looking for a situation that he can use and manipulate and get what he wants. And the prudent man is also looking for situations, and he's avoiding those that he might be taken advantage of. And it's in that sense that Abram was prudent. And so the question then would be, well, who needs this kind of prudence? Who needs this ability to be able to look at a situation and say, well, if I step in there, that I could be taken advantage of given that situation? Well, we don't have to wonder. The Bible clearly tells us, and Solomon tells us very clearly, who it is that needs this ability, this foresight, if you will, to see these things. In Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 4, Solomon said, to give prudence, and this is the purpose of writing all these Proverbs down, Solomon said, the reason that I'm doing this is to give prudence to the naive, to the youth, knowledge and discretion. Chapter 8 and verse 5 of this same book. O naive ones, understand prudence. What does it mean to be naive? Adonis, in his Dictionary of Old Testament Words, says it refers to a person who is naive concerning the complexities and the challenges of life. They're inexperienced. They're lacking insight. Macmillan Dictionary says about the same thing. A naive person lacks experience of life and tends to trust other people and believe things too easily. They're not looking and seeing the possible dangers in the situation. And so I want to suggest to you how Abram did that. Abram was a man who was prudent, not naive. Abram had a right to keep what he had recovered. But he knew who he was dealing with. And so he followed a prudent course of action. It's even possible that Abram knew the character of Sodom's king, and he recognized the possibility of being taken advantage of by him. And so he was not naive about his situation. Look at how naive people would react. Go to Proverbs 22 and verse 3. The prudent sees the evil and hides himself. Abram looked and said, there's the possibility of me being taken advantage of by this man. He saw that. He could see that being a possibility in the future. And so he said, I'm not even going to go there. But I want you to notice the rest of that verse. But the naive go on and are punished for it. Go to chapter 27 and verse 12. A prudent man sees evil and hides himself. The naive proceed, see no problems, don't see any difficulties. Oh, why are you so paranoid? They just proceed, and what happens? They pay the penalty, Solomon says. It brings us to our first application. We've got 3 applications tonight. The first one is, when we approach situations, do we show ourselves prudent or naive? Now, I'm not suggesting that we walk around looking for a bear behind every tree, but we ought to at least be looking. And sometimes we don't do that. And we proceed and we say, oh, well, I'm sure it won't be. Oh, well, I'm sure they meant. Oh, well, it surely won't be. And when we do that, we're going to fulfill what Solomon said. We're going to end up and we're going to pay the penalty. It's dangerous to be naive. Look again at what Solomon says about the naive in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 15. The naive believes everything, but the sensible man considers his step. The naive inherit foolishness, but the sensible are crowned with knowledge. You ever said of someone, you know, they are their own worst enemy? Because they never see any danger. They never see any possibility of someone taking advantage of the situation. They just keep running headlong into one disaster after another. They never seem to learn from any of their experiences. There are so many times I drive a bus for our school district, that I've had kids, and I park at the high school. I shuttle there, and so sometimes those who have not been middle schoolers, who haven't followed the rules, that's where in-school suspension is. And so there are times that I have middle schoolers on my bus that I shuttle over, only because they've done something wrong. So the other day, there was one kid that was on there, and I said, "What did you do? Why are you in ISS?" And so he told me what he had done, and so I said, "Did you learn anything from that?" I won't tell you what his answer was, but he hadn't learned anything. I hadn't learned anything. Last week, when I pulled up to the high school, guess who had ISS? The same kid. Around the bus office there, we call those kind of kids frequent flyers, because they just never seem to get it put together. Now you can say, well, that's a middle schooler. You know, their brain's not fully functioning anyway. Well, okay, that might be the case. But, you know, I've seen adults the exact same way. Just run headlong into one disaster after another, and then come and say, well, what do I need to do? What should I do? Well, you need to learn from the past 5 previous disasters. Is what you need to do, and put that knowledge into some sort of application in your life. But the naive don't do that. Proverbs chapter 1, verses 28 through 32. Wisdom is personified here, beginning in verse 20. And so she is made a person. And it says, they will call on me, this is wisdom talking, they will call on me, but I will not answer. And they will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge. They didn't want me. They hated knowledge, and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would not accept my counsel. They spurned all my reproof. So they shall eat of the fruit of their own way, and be satiated with their own devices. For the waywardness of the naive will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. Solomon had illustrations of that too in his life. He says in chapter 7, in verse 7, verse 6, we'll read, for at the window of my house I looked out through my lattice. Probably had a pretty good view of the city as king. He said, I looked out, and I saw among the naive and discerned among the youths a man lacking sense. How did Solomon know that? Because of where he goes. He goes down an alley where nothing good happens down that alley. He associates with a woman who he ought not to have been with. And as a result of that, in verse 22 it says, suddenly he follows her as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as one in fetters to the discipline of a fool, until an arrow pierces through his liver, as bird hastens to the snare, so he does not know that it will cost him his life. He's naive. There's an interesting statement that our Lord makes to his disciples when he's sending them out to preach. And it's a statement that we need to incorporate into our own lives. In Matthew chapter 10 and verse 16, after having called them in the first part of chapter 10, he now sends them out. But here's what he tells them as he sends them out. He says, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves." Don't be naive, Jesus says. When we look at situations, I'm not saying go around paranoid. I'm not saying that you ascribe to every conspiracy theory that's out there. I'm just saying at least be looking. Be observant and recognize that there are individuals who are crafty, and if you lack prudence, you'll be taken advantage of. There's a second way that Abram showed his prudence. And that is, when we ask this question, did Abram absolutely know the king of Sodom would really make that statement? Did he absolutely know that sometime in the future it's going to happen? I just know it. It's a foregone conclusion. Did he absolutely know that? No, because did you notice that the text doesn't say that he knew that this would happen? The text says he was fearful that it might happen. Wasn't a guarantee. Abram chose a course of action based solely upon a fear of what might happen in the future. That's why he chose that course. He says that to us. That brings us to our second application. Should we make decisions out of fear for what might happen or where it might lead? Let me give you some illustrations of this. A Christian man goes to encourage a Christian woman. Should he go by himself? A high school couple, they choose to go on single dates instead of double dates or group dates. Should they be alone when hormones are raging? A man or a woman decides to reconnect with their old boyfriend or their old girlfriend from 20, 25, 30 years ago. What's the reason for this? Now, are any of these things wrong? Or any of these situations, is anything sinful in any of that? No. But I hope that every one of us could look at that and say, but boy, there's danger there. And the prudent man will look at that and say, you know, I really don't need to be doing that. To you young people in our audience, I'm not saying that you're in sin if you go on a single date with your girlfriend or your boyfriend. I'm just trying to say to you, choose a prudent course of action. Be careful. Be the kind of man that Abram was, who said, I'm not going to go down that road for fear of where it might lead. So I'm not going to go down that road. I wish there were more brethren who would make these kind of choices. We had the elders told me about a fellow that came to them saying of a place where he wanted to go. I won't give you all of the details, but a place where he wanted to go. And it was around people that he didn't need to be hanging with. And that atmosphere of those people, there was going to be a lot of things going on that were sinful. And they told him, you don't need to be there. You shouldn't go there. A Christian should not be there. And guess what he did? Of course he went. He went anyway. And then when he came back, he had to confess to the elders that when he went out there, he was in and engaged in some of the sinful activities of that particular atmosphere. And he wanted help from the elders in putting his marriage back together. And they came into my office one day and said, how do you tell people don't do something and they go and do it and they come back and they want you to fix it? How do you get that to where that doesn't happen? I said, well, boy, if you guys figure that out, would you let me know? Because I haven't figured that one out yet. Because it's amazing how we as humans think, well, that happens to who? Well, everybody else, right? That's not going to happen to me. And that was exactly his justification. And it did. There are times in our lives, brethren, where we need to just stop and say, you know, I'm fearful of where this might lead. There's some prudent action that I can take that I don't find myself going down that road. I want you to think about what Paul said in Romans chapter 13 and verse 14. Our young people back home get tired of me hammering on this, but I'm not changing. In Romans chapter 13 and verse 14, the Apostle Paul says, verse 13, let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy. And you're reading through that, and Christians are reading through that and think, well, why would he warn us about that? Well, I would never do that. Well, I would never be engaged in that. But read the next verse. But put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lust. There are times when we might say, well, I'm not going to set out to do drunkenness. I'm not going to set out to carouse. I'm not going to set out to be sexually promiscuous. But I can find myself making a provision and not thinking prudently and then being engaged in that. And then when all of it is said and done, you look at yourself in the mirror and think, how did I get here? I didn't intend on doing that. I didn't mean to act that way. I didn't mean to commit fornication, to get drunk. I didn't mean to do those drugs. I didn't set out to do that. No, but where were you? And why were you there? You see, you made an opportunity. And guess who's crafty and is going to make sure to take advantage of you? That's why you've got to be prudent. Don't make provisions. Rather, don't make the devil's job easy. Don't give him any help. Don't make provision for the flesh. Abram looked at it and said, you know what? I can see how this thing might go down, and we're not even going to go down that road. So he said, you keep it. Could that have been a help to Abram? Sure. He was rich, but would have been even better for him. But he said, I'm not even going to go down that road. The third thing that I want to suggest to you that I was impressed with in Abram's prudence is that this was not a spur-of-the-moment decision on Abram's part. Did you notice that he says, when the king offers him this, he says, I have sworn. Abram had already decided while he was on his return journey what he was going to do. It would almost seem as though Abram had played this scene through in his mind, anticipating the possibility of the king saying this, and had already decided what his answer would be, and had already made an oath to God regarding it. He said, if this thing plays out like this, and if this king offers me this, I'm not going to take it. And Lord, I swear that I will not take this. I will make an oath to thee that if this is how this situation goes down, I won't do it. I won't take it. And so our third and final application. Do we anticipate what might happen in certain situations and determine what we will do ahead of time? Abram did. Abram saw it, he anticipated it, and said, here's my course of action. Here's my, sometimes we might say, exit strategy. Here's what I'm going to do. Think about a couple of situations here. Situation sometimes wherein difficulties are unavoidable. You've got a brother that is in sin, that you're having to go and you're having to confront him about his sin, rebuke him for his sin. We would like to think that that brother would, in humility, just say, you're right. We would like to think that everybody would respond like David responded when Nathan went to him. But people don't always respond that way, do they? Because a lot of times people get what? They get defensive. And they get obstinate. And they start accusing you of things. And they start attacking you. And who do you think you are? And what have you gone to this person over here? Do you know what they do? Do you know what this person over here does? You know, you're not so perfect yourself. And so all of these accusations, and you got to know going into it, that this is what's going to happen. I know of situations wherein they have warned and told maybe a particular person, now look, we're going to go into this meeting, and you need to understand that this may be what you get. This may be the response that you get. This may be how they attack you. And here is how you need to act. You need to recognize what might take place. But then there are situations wherein there may be only the possibility of difficulties being present. There was a young couple that we had with us, and his family especially, oh boy, just very worldly. And in fact, he had been very worldly. He had been on drugs, he had done drugs, and his family was still involved in that kind of a lifestyle. And they were attempting to still have some kind of a relationship because, they all had young children, and so there would be birthday parties. And so the elders and I, this particular time, we said, okay, you're going to go to this party. And you're going to know that there may be this person here that is always stirring up drama. And this young man that we were working with that was a Christian, one of his issues that he struggled with was anger. And he could lose his temper. And so we told him, look, going into it, you're going to have to know what your strategy is. If you come to that party and here's this fella that causes you difficulty and causes you to lose your cool, then going into it, you've got to know, if he's there, here's what I'm going to do. And you've got to know exactly going into it what you're going to do so that you're not caught off guard by that. Whatever it might be. A gathering of friends or family or workmates, or where we think that there might be inappropriateness or we think that sin might happen, we've got to know that there are some situations that are unavoidable, but we've got to have an exit strategy. We've got to have a plan. If this happens, here's what I'm going to do. Because that's what Abram had. Abram went into it and said, if this happens, here's how I'm going to react. And he gave an oath unto the Lord. I want you to think about the parable of the wise and the foolish virgins. Why were 5 of them called foolish and 5 of them called wise? Because this matter of waiting for the bridegroom, there wasn't, they didn't have, at least with their weddings, they weren't so schedule oriented like we are a lot of times. And so sometimes the bridegroom would delay before he would get to the party, if you will, the feast. And so one never knew how long it would be, how long it would take. And so there were 5 virgins that recognized, we're not really sure how long it's going to take, so we're going to make sure and be prepared for if this event takes longer, if he is delayed, we're going to make sure that we're ready, we're prepared for that scenario. And there were 5 of them that weren't. And when the bridegroom came, the 5 that weren't had left to buy more oil. And when the door was shut and the 5 that had prepared for that kind of a scenario went in, and the 5 foolish got back and tried to go in, they were rejected. They hadn't prepared. They hadn't thought it out about what might happen. And so they weren't ready. I want to summarize this by looking at the 3 applications. Abram demonstrated prudence by not being naive about the situation with the king. He showed wisdom. He showed prudence by making a decision from a fear of what might happen. And so he showed some foresight there. And then he showed prudence by anticipating a situation and making a plan of action. He showed preparedness. Brethren, we will face situations in life wherein we have got to apply the prudence of Abram. And if we fail, we've already read, if we prove ourselves to be naive, we've already read what happens to those who are naive. They run headlong into danger and destruction. Here's the difficulty, and the more important thing for us. We'll do that, and it will have eternal consequences. It's not just a loss of money, a loss of goods. It is our soul, eternal consequences. And so while the faith of Abraham is definitely something that we should emulate, so too the prudence of Abram. Take your songbooks out and turn them to the number that's been selected. If you're here this evening and your life is not what it needs to be, if this is something that you are struggling with, then you have good elders here who will help you. Did you notice in one of the passages that we read in Proverbs chapter 1, where wisdom was calling out. Did you notice that one of the reasons why wisdom said that these people would not listen is that they refused counsel? If you refuse counsel, brethren, especially from godly elders, then you do it to your own destruction. You do it to your own harm. They look out for your souls. They're in charge. They have the charge of your souls, of leading this flock. And if you ignore their counsel and you arrogantly think, well, that won't happen to me, or they don't know my situation, or they don't understand me, all you're doing is just running headlong into destruction. Be careful. If you're here this evening, your life is not what it needs to be, and you struggle with this quality, then let us know. If there's something that we can do, that we can pray with you, let us know how we might help. If you'll come forward, we'll be happy to do that. Come forward. Well, together we stand while we sing.